Thanks for joining me today. My name is Talon, and as a reminder, last week I did a presentation summary of Bill Gates' book, How to Prevent a Climate Disaster. And a number that comes up constantly in that book is 51 billion tons. Now, that's the number of emissions that we produce each year on average. And it's expected to go up over time as more people climb out of poverty and they contribute more to that number. And it's also the number that we need to reduce to zero in order to avoid a climate disaster. Now, one of the main focuses of Bill Gates' book is the biggest 5 contributors to that number, and we'll be diving into greater depth on one of those today. Shown here are the 5 biggest contributors to the 51 billion tons. And as you can see, the biggest piece of the pie by far is making things. Now, by making things, he means specifically steel, concrete, and plastic. Concrete is a miracle of engineering. It can be made so dense that it can shield patients in hospitals from nuclear radiation. It can be used to support a bridge, and it can actually be made to make floating bridges. It's rust resistant, rot proof, and it's non-flammable. And as you can see here, this is the 520 bridge. This is a bridge near Bill Gates' home, and it's the longest floating bridge in the world. And somehow it actually uses concrete to float. It makes these big air-filled cells made of concrete, and that's how it's able to float. It's actually a miracle, really. Now, the downside to concrete is it's one of the biggest contributors to global warming, and it's one of the hardest materials to fix. Every year, between replacing or repairing existing roads, bridges, and buildings, or putting up new ones, America alone produces more than 96 million tons of cement. That's one of the main ingredients of concrete, and that's over 600 pounds per American. To get concrete, you mix gravel, sand, water, and cement. Now, the first 3 are relatively easy on the climate. They're not that big of a deal, but it's the cement that's the problem. To get cement, you need calcium, and to get calcium, you need limestone, which contains calcium plus carbon and oxygen. And then you burn it in a furnace, and along with some other materials, and after burning the limestone, you get the thing that you want, so the calcium, plus something that you don't want, carbon dioxide. Now, nobody knows how to do this process without getting the thing that you don't want. It's really a chemical reaction. Limestone plus heat equals calcium plus carbon dioxide. It's a 1-to-1 relationship, so if you make a ton of cement, you'll get a ton of carbon dioxide. And there's really no way to get rid of the carbon dioxide at this point unless you use carbon capture technology, which is very expensive. Right now, China is the biggest producer by far. They outpace second place India by over 7 times, and they produce more cement than the rest of the world combined. Between now and 2050, the world cement production will go up a bit. Even as the building boom slows in China, other emerging countries will need to build up infrastructure as their incomes rise. And eventually it'll slow down to around 4 billion tons a year. Of these 3 materials, cement is definitely the hardest to improve emissions-wise. It's a chemical reaction. Limestone plus heat equals calcium oxide plus carbon dioxide. But a few companies have some ideas. One company is using recycled carbon dioxide, possibly produced during the making of cement, and they inject it back into the cement before it's used on the construction site. So far, they've only been able to reduce emissions by 10%, but they hope to be able to reduce it by 33%. And they have a lot of support already. They have a ton of customers, including McDonald's and Microsoft. Another approach that's far more theoretical would be to make the cement out of seawater and carbon dioxide captured by another operation, hopefully power plants. And if this works, they think that they can reduce emissions by up to 70%, or possibly even more. Even if these two approaches work, we won't have truly carbon-free cement. So we would need to use carbon capture technology, which again is expensive. So more innovation is needed. Of course, we don't just use concrete for building things. Americans use as much steel as cement. 600 pounds per person per year is made, and this is excluding what is recycled. Steel is used in so many things, from cars to buildings to our appliances like our fridge and washing machine. It also goes fantastic with cement. When you insert steel rods into a block of concrete, you get a magical building material that's both extremely cheap and can withstand massive amounts of weight, and it resists breaking when you twist it. The steel rods basically act like bones, and there's tons of data that shows that we'll be using 50% more steel by 2050, but a picture says 1,000 words. Take a look at these two pictures of these two cities. Now they look like completely different cities, right? But in fact, they're both pictures of Shanghai taken from the exact same vantage point. In order to make steel, you need to separate oxygen from the iron, and you add a tiny bit of carbon. You can both make it hot and add a bit of carbon by melting iron ore at very high temperatures in the presence of oxygen and a type of coal called coke. The coke will obviously heat up the iron, and it'll produce the carbon it needs at the same time, but it produces way too much carbon. It's a totally wasteful process. A small amount of the carbon attaches with the iron, forming the steel, but the rest of the carbon attaches to oxygen, forming what we don't want, carbon dioxide. Making 1 ton of steel produces a whopping 1.8 tons of carbon dioxide that's released into the atmosphere. And right now we're producing about 2.8 billion tons of carbon dioxide because of steel production. And by mid-century, it's expected to be 5 billion tons. Now, this is an extremely wasteful process. Like I said, it produces way more carbon than what's needed. But the reason why we do it this way is because it's extremely cheap, just using the coal called coke. And up until recently, there was no incentive to produce the steel any other way. Synthetic plastics, like we're used to today, have only been around since the 1950s. They're made by refining oil, coal, or natural gas, and then processing the refined products in a variety of different ways. Although plastics have a bad reputation, which for the most part is fair, that they are pretty bad, they're also what allow fuel-efficient cars to be so light. Most modern cars about 50% of the volume is plastic. However, the plastic only makes up about 10% of the weight. Plastic floating around the ocean it's a big problem environmental protection-wise, especially since it can poison wildlife. But in terms of climate change, plastic isn't that huge of a deal. And this is because carbon really likes bonding to plastic. Depending on the type of plastic you're talking about, roughly half of the carbon stays inside of the plastic. And the silver lining of all of this is that because it takes hundreds of years for the plastic to degrade, the plastic actually acts as a pretty good carbon sink. Please take a look at this green premium table from Bill Gates' book. Now, as you can see, the green premium range for cement is massive compared to steel and plastic. The difference between sustainably made cement and unsustainably made cement, like the difference in price, is up to 140%. Now you would think that because this difference is so huge that it would be relatively easy to make a dent in this difference, but because of that chemical reaction we talked about earlier, it's very, very hard. In order to understand where these green premiums are coming from, we need to understand what's actually contributing to these emissions. So we emit greenhouse gases when we use fossil fuels to generate the electricity for factories and manufacturing operations. We use fossil fuels to generate the heat needed for these manufacturing operations, like when we melt iron ore to make the steel. And finally, when we actually make these materials, carbon dioxide is often a byproduct, like especially for cement, like we talked about. For this first issue, it's definitely feasible. We need to make massive amounts of reliable, cheap electricity and massive amounts of batteries so that we have this reliable electricity around the clock. With the second issue, when you're looking for temperatures in the thousands of degrees, electricity isn't really an economical option with today's technology. You would need to either use nuclear power or fossil fuels in combination with carbon capture technology. But again, carbon capture technology isn't free, and the costs will get passed on to consumers. And then finally, for the third issue, what do we do for natural processes that naturally produce greenhouse gases as a byproduct? And for situations like this, there's really no option aside from just shutting everything down. So we'll definitely need a ton of innovation in this space, especially for the second and third issue. So what are some of Bill's suggestions for reducing the green premium? Well, first, the most important thing is we need plenty of reliable, clean electricity. Electricity already makes up about a quarter of the energy used in the manufacturing center. We need to develop new ways of producing this energy in a completely carbon-free way. And this is one of the easier steps that is absolutely feasible. Soon we'll need even more electricity as we do today, as we move towards electric vehicles, and for a new way of reducing emissions called electrification. Electrification is the process of using electricity instead of fossil fuels for certain manufacturing processes. As example, you can actually make steel using electricity to replace coal. One company has produced a new exciting technique called Molten Oxide Electrolysis. And basically, instead of burning iron ore in a furnace with coke, like we talked about earlier, you pass electricity through a cell that has a mixture of liquid iron oxide and some other ingredients, and the electricity makes the iron oxide break apart, leaving you with pure oxygen as a byproduct. No carbon dioxide is made at all. Now, this is an amazing innovation, and it has so much promise, but it still requires massive amounts of electricity, and it hasn't yet proven to work on a industrial scale. Another awesome idea is we might be able to create a form of net negative emission plastic. We would basically be turning plastic into a form of carbon sink this way. First, we would need a zero carbon way to power the refining process. We could do that with electricity or with hydrogen made from clean electricity. Second, we would need a form of carbon without burning coal. The best case scenario would be for us to take air, extract the carbon from the carbon dioxide in the air, and then use that as the source of carbon. But this is very, very expensive to do. It would take a lot of innovation to bring the green premium down on that. Another source of carbon could also be from plants. Third, we would need a zero emission way to heat this whole process up, a zero emission form of heat. This would most likely come from clean electricity or from hydrogen or from natural gas fitted with a carbon capture device. If this all works, we could have a form of plastic that actually reduces the carbon that's put into the atmosphere. We could literally inject the carbon taken from the atmosphere into items that we use on a day-to-day basis, like bottles. And this is probably the most exciting of all of the possible ideas he suggested in this chapter. So in summary, in order to get to zero emissions in the manufacturing sector of cement, steel, and plastic, we would need to electrify every process possible. We would need to get that electricity from a power grid that provides cheap, reliable electricity that's been decarbonized. And we would need to use carbon capture technology to absorb the remaining emissions. We really need to innovate on carbon capture technology and bring the green premium way down. And we would need to use materials more efficiently. All four of these things will require a ton of innovation. My first question for everyone on Packback will be, can you think of any ways we can reduce the emissions of steel, concrete, or plastic? And for question two, it'll be, can you think of any ways we can nudge companies to innovate in these materials and try to reduce the green premiums? I wanted to thank everybody for joining me today. And just wanted to say I highly recommend reading Bill Gates' book, like the full book. It's a great read. And thanks again, and have a great rest of your day.